Aristocratic ideas. Aristocratic ideas are composed of noble knights, military tradition, local nobility, serfdom, noble officers, international diplomacy, noble connections, and the finisher. So, noble knights, unsurprisingly, an idea that calls itself noble knights helps your cavalry. It makes them cheaper and it makes them fight better. However, cav are, as a general rule, unreasonably expensive for what they do. That being said, how would you best use this idea? Well, you would use this with cav that are especially good. So early game horde cav have extreme numbers of pips compared to everything else, so they're quite strong. You could use this well with that, especially as it's a first idea, so you could unlock it quite early while you still have the extra advantage of the horde cavalry having so many more pips than everything else. You can also use it with the estate interaction-based cavalry, which get extra modifiers. So the Russian Cossack cavalry and the Manchu Horde cavalry, which can both be raised via state or estate interactions, which means you can avoid paying for them, which is one of my objections for cavalry, how expensive they are to buy. But also they get extra combat modifiers, and those stack well with this combat modifier. Additionally, you can make good use of this by stacking cavalry combat modifiers. So maybe you play as someone like Poland, who gets a nice significant cavalry combat bonus. You stack this idea, you stack another one, and eventually you end up with cavalry that are actually pretty strong, even though they're quite expensive. Okay, next, military traditions. Military tech costs to level up your military tech are 10% cheaper. So this is a way of getting long-term savings on mil techs. So it's an idea that is best taken early game when you still have the largest number of mil tech ups remaining. It helps you to rubber band catching up in mil tech, which you may be lagging behind a little bit on, owing to having spent mil points buying the idea rather than teching up. And it's basically just a long-term mil point saving idea. It can also be used to help you mil tech up ahead of time, extra ahead of everyone else because it's even cheaper. But, you know, be very careful with that because it's a lot of points to invest teching up ahead of time. Local nobility, minus 0.25 monthly autonomy change all the time, even when at war. And ticking 0.1 yearly absolutism. So, how do you use this? Well, you would best use it in a highly expansionistic game where you take lots and lots of land, and you probably raise the autonomy in that land to prevent unrest, to prevent rebels, as well as any game in which you are at war a lot. In both cases, you're going to have a lot of land. Well, in the first case, you're going to have a lot of land, and in the second case, you're also not going to be getting the ticking autonomy reduction from being at peace. And then this can provide you a way of still slowly milking more out of the land, slowly driving the autonomy down, even though you're always at war. However, keep in mind that the ticking autonomy rate from this idea is quite low. It's half that compared to the autonomy change granted from the economic idea that does the same thing, that modifies autonomy change, ticking autonomy change. So it's weakish in terms of that. However, it also does have a second half of the idea, which is the yearly absolutism buff. That being said, it's an extremely slow rate of absolutism gain, and it completely loses its usefulness once you reach your absolutism cap. So I tend to think that it is a very weak extra little bonus, and I'd just rather have the extra monthly autonomy change rate equal to that from the economic idea. But oh well. Moving on. Serfdom, plus 33% national manpower modifier. This is a very big increase to your manpower recovery, which allows you to run more or larger armies and wars without running out of manpower. Having a larger standing army and a more complete manpower pool helps you look more attractive to potential allies and less of a attractive target to potential enemies, including coalition members. So this is not just as it first appears a buff to your military, it also has flow-on effects to your diplomacy. Getting towards the end, noble officers, minus 1% army and navy tradition decays, so it helps keep your army and navy tradition high. What are these useful for? Well, higher naval tradition provides a passive buff for trade steering, privateer effectiveness, sailor income, almost more importantly than all of that, except maybe the trade steering and privateer effectiveness, is naval morale buff but most of the buffs, except for the morale, are fairly marginal. The same applies for army tradition. So army tradition, high army tradition, provides similar bonuses on land. It increases land morale, it increases land morale recovery rate, it increases manpower recovery rate, and it also helps your siege speed. All of which are nice, but none of which are sort of big and flashy and a large modifier to any one of these. Instead, it's a big diffuse web of teeny tiny modifiers. International diplomacy. International diplomacy gives you +1 diplomat and +1 leader without upkeep. This is just so much better than so many of the other diplomatic idea group ideas. Not specifically diplomatic ideas themselves, but diplomatic idea group ideas, which often only ever give you a single diplomat with their idea unlock, and don't give you any other bonus. This one gives you a diplomat and extra crap as well, an extra leader without upkeep. So, how do you use it? Well, an extra diplomat is useful for helping to keep large, threatening neighbours from being hostile. It helps prevent coalitions by keeping people above 60 relations. It helps you fabricate claims faster because you've got an extra diplomat to help with that. It helps you maintain subject relations and integrate them because you've got an extra diplomat to raise relations with them and an extra diplomat to use to integrate them. It can help with exploration insofar as rather than going exploring manually, you steal people's maps by having a spy and then stealing their maps, as well as all the other less common spy actions such as infiltrate administration and sabotage recruitment and whatnot. Additionally, the bonus towards having an extra lead without upkeep is best used, well, one of the obvious uses is to have an extra general lying around. This can help you maximize your siege and combat abilities. If you've got an extra general, you've got an extra chance at having one with high pips in a relevant stat. Maybe you have an extra general with high siege who you use for sieging. Maybe you have an extra general with high maneuver who you use for avoiding attrition and for running around and chasing enemy stacks. Maybe you have one with extra fire or shock who you use for frontline combat. In any case, you've got an extra one, so you've got more chances of having the kind of stats lying around that you want. It can also be used to keep, which I usually just take and delete the free admiral you get from the estates, because I'd rather generally have more generals and not have an admiral. But if you've got an extra leader slot, maybe the extra admiral can find some use. You can use it to help your trade steering if you get really good. If you get really good maneuver, he can actually provide a fairly significant buff to your merchant fleets. Alternatively, you can use it to run an explorer or a conquistador without needing to cut into the number of generals you can field in areas of interest. So it adds a lot of flexibility for number of leaders, and it also helps you, I suppose, keep up on time on Miltech, because sometimes it's a bit tempting to run over the leader cap to have an extra explorer or an extra general, and this just helps prevent that cost. The last idea, noble connections, plus 20% available mercenaries. So based on your force limit, there is a fraction of your force limit that you get in available mercenaries, and this modifies that fraction upwards, so you get more available mercenaries. This allows you to run a larger merc army despite having a relatively low base force limit. This makes making sizable merc stacks to send in especially high attrition locations such as jungle sieges or sieges anywhere where you just want to conserve your real manpower. Provinces with low force limits so that they can take all the brunt of the losses from being over that province's capacity to support. Basically, it just encourages you to have a larger standing merc army to use. And finally, the finisher, +1 leader siege. So when you roll a land leader, generals, conquistadors, and so forth, and you're rolling for pips, they start with a guaranteed siege pip. In the event that they rolled enough siege pips to get the maximum, then they can sort of overflow the pips in this bonus pip into other categories, which can help increase your general's statistics in other categories as well, although getting 6 siege is so rare that it's almost never going to happen. Now what do siege pips do? Why would you want an extra siege pip? Well, a siege pip helps make sieges faster, which can let you race enemies for sieges. So rather than engaging each other's army, you sort of run around each other, go sit on each other's forts, and if you've got more siege pips than them, there's a reasonable likelihood that you will finish your siege before they finish their siege. Then you can turn around, rush back to your fort, hopefully before they finish their siege, smack them about, and then boom, you have a siege and they don't, and you're in an amazing position to winning the war. It also helps minimize manpower losses. Obviously, if you finish a siege quicker, you aren't there as long, you aren't suffering as many attrition ticks, you aren't getting as many negative siege ticks, so it lets you conserve some manpower. It also helps your economy somewhat. I mean, you've got to pay for those reinforcements. It lets you get to peacetime sooner because your siege is finished sooner, so you can hopefully finish your war sooner, which means you're potentially not having to pay your army. If you finish a war, you might go down to low maintenance. It also, if you finish a war, it might also allow you to then be at peace and have the ticking autonomy reduction. So it's also a bonus to your economy. So in summary, aristocratic ideas provide a number of small economic buffs, extra manpower and the ability to save manpower either directly through the use of mercenaries, by having higher military tech than your opponents, which lets you beat them up very easily and with suffering low losses, having more and better leaders, and it is pretty unique in that it allows you to get an extra diplomat without needing to resort to taking a diplomatic type idea group.